A warm welcome to you, our listeners, and thanks for joining us today. We've been speaking a lot about the physical aspect of endurance performance and the genetics associated with how to adapt what we're doing in our training to support and enhance the genetic code we've been given. And one would be inclined to say that sports performance is all about priming the physical body to do this. But as a coach and having worked with many varying levels of athletes, I can categorically say that physical capacity to perform is only 50% of the equation. So what's the other 50? You guessed it, our mental and emotional psyche. It is something we don't necessarily see as spectators of sport, but it is a much talked about topic currently, and I'm very excited to drill down into this with clinical psychologist Neil Tuck. Now, Neil is based at the Sports Science Institute in Cape Town and has extensive experience working in hospitals, private practice, and performance consulting in the corporate and sports arena. He works with individuals and teams and helps them to perform and achieve in their area of expertise. So welcome, Neil, and thanks for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Di. Lovely to be here.
Obviously qualified as a clinical psychologist, but where did the interest in sports come from?
Relevant question to sort of explain why I end up where I am now. As you pointed out in the intro, Di, my traditional training was in the clinical field and spent several years in hospitals and in a sort of purist clinical capacity working as a psychologist. But I think it soon became clear to me, and I became more and more interested and intrigued at the prospect of perhaps intervening with people a little further at a different point on the wellness continuum, if I could put it that way. So my focus was always to help recover people from significant emotional and mental adversity and whatever challenges they were facing. But that's almost where the process ended. And I think it became more and more clear to me that we leaving a whole area of psychology unexplored, and that's the positive end of the spectrum. Once we've got back to overcoming adversity, then the exciting part of the journey starts, and that is exploring wellness and exploring the link between wellness and performance and the psychology of performance. I think it soon became clear to me that I was very interested in helping people stay well rather than get well. And that's in no way diminishing the importance of the work that we do in the clinical space. That's kind of where my path took me. Initially, it was significantly in the corporate arena where we designed and implemented different programs and workshops and interventions relating to helping people understand and master the psychology of performance and well-being. But then it naturally transitioned to performance in the sporting world as well. And that's sort of cut to the end of the story. Here I am at Sports Science and in a the privileged position to be able to work with athletes across many different sporting codes, from elite athletes to people in the early stages of their sporting career, and helping them do the right stuff right at the outset. And as you pointed out, in fact, I often ask athletes, whether it's in a workshop or whether it's individually, to give a percentage of just give me a number in terms of the importance of what I call above the neck aspects of performance. And many of them would actually say a number much greater than 50%.
Really?
And then when you drill down, you realize that they're actually they're not, in terms of their training, their preparation, their focus is nowhere near that percentage in terms of their repertoire of training and preparation. Yeah, so that's kind of what brings me to where we are now. Very excited.
Why is it that our mental psychology or our capacity, why does it have such a big bearing on how we perform as athletes?
Di, I think, and I'm probably stating the very obvious here, we all have incredibly powerful minds. That's a no-brainer. But it's whether we have enough insight and mastery to harness the power of that mind, or whether we are in blind spots and the net result is that we are at the mercy of that power. So our mind is going to have a significant impact on our performance and our well-being, whether we like it or not. It's just too powerful and it's too big a component of our entire system to not. But it's a case of whether we become proactive and preemptive in gaining understanding about what makes us tick and why, and draw start to connect the dots between our performance and the psychology of our performance. That's the topic we're going to unpack in more detail.
Yeah.
But I think that to me is how I sum it up, is the challenge is to get on the front foot and be in control of this unbelievable mind that we have rather than at the mercy of it, where it's enhancing our performance rather than it's compromising our performance.
So interesting. And I think there's been a massive shift over the years in terms of actually recognizing this, that the mind is such a powerful weapon in performance. I mean, if we think about the last 20 years, 20 years ago, nobody ever spoke about one's mental capacity, emotional state, and how that impacted performance. So how has it changed and morphed over the years, and why? Is it just more research now that has now put the spotlight on the fact that our mind is so powerful? What has changed over the last 20 years?
I think, and it definitely has changed. I think it is still work in progress, to be honest. I think there's still quite a way to go to give it the priority and the attention that it really deserves, but it definitely has changed. And I think you hit the nail on the head. I think there was probably 20 years ago, first and foremost, it just wasn't prioritized. And it was, the narrative was, there's nothing wrong with me. I'm good to go. And I think we're now moving to a point where no, it's not about whether there's something wrong with you. It's about using the tools to make mental fitness a differentiator and a performance enhancer. So you're almost missing a trick, and you are leaving important things out of your performance toolkit if you don't focus on it. So that's shifted. And then I think what's also very significant, is that, and I'm very grateful for this, that very high profile people in the sporting world, whether celebrities, but people who are really public figures, have been very courageous in going public, so to speak, and sharing their stories. So it's kind of I think it's played a very important role and added to this destigmatization of so-called mental health. There was a time where mental health was used, the term mental health, although the two words are positive, mental health, would always associate with a mental health institution or mental health assistance, etc., etc. And now I think we're slowly able to reframe it as mental health means just that. Yes, we sometimes find ourselves on the negative end of the wellness continuum, where we do have significant emotional adversity or mental health challenges, and we address that. But there's a lot more beyond that for folk like, whether it's Simone Biles, whether it's Naomi Osaka, and many other people have almost given the message that it's safe to be vulnerable. It's safe to share that. It's not a weakness. In fact, it's very liberating. And it's starting to have a contagion effect in a positive way, that people are finding it okay to pitch up. There was a time where people would come and sit outside my consulting room and almost look like they want to hide because they don't want to be seen to be going to see the shrink. And now people are quite loud and proud about it. And I have very high profile athletes that sit outside my office, and it's a big deal. We're going to see the sports psychologist. It's like, and then I'm going to the bio, and then I'm going to the nutrition.
It's part of my repertoire. So amazing. I mean, I think that's brilliant to hear that it is changing like that. So maybe you can give us some insight into, you dealing with top athletes, you say, and what are the main reasons for them coming to you? Can you kind of break that down for us?
Sure. So, I think there's some instances where people would come to see me and they purely are what I would call on the front foot. So it's purely a proactive, preemptive strike, as it were. And they are very enlightened, and they know that this is one element of their overall performance that they can fine tune and they can hone. So that's a percentage of people, but I'd probably say a greater percentage are people who either themselves or perhaps a coach has identified certain development areas. Let's not call them weaknesses, but development areas of focus where they have clearly identified that there are certain aspects from a mental fitness, a mental and emotional aspect of their performance, which is compromising their overall performance. And a lot of the time, it's all sort of fine nuances because these are high-performing people. They're functioning at a very high level, they're performing at a very high level, but they are finding certain areas difficult and challenging for them. In that regard, I think there's in fact, I was asked a little while ago by the research team here at CISA to just sort of give me a rundown. I'll give them a rundown of what I would regard as the 4 top issues that people present with to me. Okay. And I mean, it's not an exact science, but to me, the first and most common challenge that people present with is this whole thing of overthinking. So, and of course, there's many complex contributing factors as to why one person or one athlete is overthinking. And it's almost where, because of expectation, whether that's expectation from the public, whether that's just personal expectation, or whether it comes from much further back where it's parental pressure or whatever else, that when the time comes to trust their preparation, their process, their talent, suddenly there's second guessing and they kind of start to overthink. And the overthinking can be in the sense of, we always talk about these cognitive errors that we make, where we either catastrophize, we generalize, or we personalize. But it's a cognitive error. It's a mental inefficiency, if you will. And I often speak to athletes and speak about wheel spin. So we're using a lot of energy, but we're not really getting traction going forward. So we get two in our head, so to speak. And how does one get out of one's head? Well, first of all, you identify where is the wheel spin happening? Yes. Where is the mental inefficiency? Well, I've done my training. I'm well prepared. I have talent, otherwise I wouldn't be in this particular competition or this game or this whatever else. And I have to trust the process. And anything beyond that is wheel spin, or it's negative energy that's just chewing up bandwidth that I do not have to spare. So that whole realm of overthink is a huge theme. Sometimes it has more underlying origins in terms of an underlying self-belief issue, and it's built a whole lot of negative self-talk and scripts. Other times it really is just almost a bad habit that has developed. And thank goodness to neuroplasticity and being able to reprogram in a way. It's about overcoming that bad habit, and it's about changing it thought by thought and action by action. And in that sense, I think I always say to athletes, and I use the term athlete broadly, you would never expect optimal physical fitness to just fall in your lap and to just be good at it.
Yes. You've got to work hard.
You have practice and you have repetition, and there's certain skills and there's certain techniques, and it's just the hard yards and it's the heavy lifting to get there. Why would it be any different with mental fitness? Why would one suddenly just magically be mentally fit? So you need to gain insight, understand your own psychology. What's the best of it? What's the worst of it? So it's sort of, what are my natural strengths and weaknesses or development areas? And then work with those. And not just overcoming the development areas and the weaknesses, but celebrating and enhancing the gifts as well.
Yes.
So that the overthink is one. The other is, I think, just managing pre-performance nerves. And that's just natural. We're not abnormal if we experience it. But how do we find that sweet spot where, and I realize, I mean, you're very experienced in this field, so I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but the issue is being able to find enough of that adrenaline and arousal to take you to the so-called sweet spot, which is calm focus, not calm distraction or not anxious focus, but calm focus, the so-called being in the zone and staying there. And if you move beyond that, where it becomes a negative energy burn, how do you pull yourself back to the zone and so on? You know, and that there's very specific techniques and approaches that one can use to help people to get in the zone and to stay in the zone. And in fact, a lot of the time it's for that person, it's very individually, to say, well, what does the zone feel like for me? What am I thinking? What am I feeling physically? And what are my rituals to get into the zone? Am I, in fact, misinterpreting very good adrenaline and arousal as anxiety and I must shoo it away? Or do I sort of positively reframe that as this is me becoming performance ready?
Yes.
So that's a second sort of theme that often comes up, is helping folk to just get in and stay in the zone, if you will. And then I suppose a third theme which often comes up is that of resilience and bounce back. You know, the phenomenon, just because we are mere mortals, whether we are gifted sports people or not, we are mere mortals and we will mess up, or we will get injured, or we will not make the first 15 and we'll be benched. And some folk have a challenge with recalibrating and resetting in the shortest possible time to bounce back, if you will. So that's another area that I think people sometimes need to hone their skill to an extent, you know, where they can sort of feel like they can absorb a loss or a setback or a bad performance or a bad round of golf or whatever else, and sort of have a set of have a narrative that serves them well, or to say, okay, that's past. There's nothing I can do about it. What can I learn from it? You know, I'm just pulling things out of the sky at the moment, but that person will invariably know what they're saying to themselves and what their belief system is that is not serving them well, and that is causing them to be stuck in that negative experience. And how do they come back? And of course, that's the hallmark of great athletes. It often is what differentiates them. Absolutely. Is that resilience factor. It's not about whether you fall, you know, and I know that's so cliched, but it's about the speed and the way in which you're able to recover from that.
Yeah.
And in fact, part of that resilience is teaching people that it is okay to have negative emotion. That it is, you know, it's an absolute bridge too far to expect this cliched phenomenon of just constant positive thinking, you know, and can't entertain negative thinking. You can't entertain negative thinking if it becomes the narrative and if it starts to inform negatively on your performance. But to have a negative thought or a emotion of disappointment because you've just had a devastating injury that's going to put you out of performance for 6 weeks, it would be very abnormal if you didn't have those thoughts. So it's almost normalizing that and not demonizing it and letting it sort of go through you rather than try and shoo it away.
Right. And you think of some of these high-profile athletes, you know, that so many people look up to, and you know, the public can be so critical of these athletes.
Yes.
And when they do fall down, or when they do make a mistake, or they do have an injury, you know, the public can really, really destroy these athletes. And is that something that you've come across and that you've helped athletes deal with, just how the public perceives them and the criticism that comes from the public and how they deal with that?
Without a doubt, it's a very significant factor. And as you point out, more and more so, the higher profile the person becomes. Because then, you know, there are so many stakeholders in that person's performance. Be that sponsors, be that coaches, be that the general public. And we are, you know, we can be as the general public and as supporters of teams and individual sports heroes, we can be very supportive, but we can also be very uncompromising. And I think part of helping folk like that is helping them understand what are the variables they can control and what is of concern but not within their control. So it's almost like, and we always speak about creating this bubble around you and finding safe people, and dialing out sources of feedback that are not relevant and important for you. So it doesn't mean that you become impervious to feedback and you're in a blind spot where you're not receptive to critical feedback, but where you are forced, because if not, you're kind of dead in the water. You're forced, for instance, to actually just go off social media for a while, or have a coach almost gatekeep for you, because it can become ruthless. I mean, there's so many examples of that, you know, in current circles and recently. So it undoubtedly is a factor, and I think, you know, as one climbs the ladder and you become the elite athlete, with that comes this huge expectation. And part of that expectation is that we are bulletproof, that we are, you know, geez, this person is such a talented athlete or rugby player or golfer. Surely mentally they must be all together. But I think we forget that, yes, other than the gift of that particular sporting talent, in every other respect, we are a representative sample of the norm. And we have our normal vulnerabilities, and we have our backstory, and we have our life history. And, you know, so there's only one common denominator with all of those high-performing elite athletes, is that they are gifted at what they do. Everything else, it's like the rest of us. And I think that's where there was, and that's, I think, the lovely shift that we're seeing, that people are embracing that now. And thanks to those people being more open in sharing some of their challenges that they had.
So interesting. And you know, we've looked at the genetics through these shows that we've been doing, and how you know, your genetics can determine how you should be training and what kind of stimulus you need. And obviously we look at talented athletes, and obviously that's in the genes. And sometimes, you know, we come across athletes and we say to ourselves, geez, that athlete is just so mentally strong. You know, they seem so resilient. Let's talk about the things that go into the factors that promote mental resilience, or,
Sure.
you know, the genetics, past experiences, our history. You know, for somebody that's mentally strong, where does that come from?
Yeah.
We can just talk about that.
I think it does all begin with how we've chosen our parents, so to speak. And so absolutely, there's a genetic loading and a predisposition which tees us up to be naturally good at something, or naturally gifted and have a strength in a particular area and not. But I suppose that's the departure point. But and again, I mean, this is your field of expertise, but it is undoubtedly so. And I think we've long underestimated the extent to which we can mitigate or enhance through the factors that we can control. And that is, first and foremost, just taking the leap of faith to learn more about it and to understand our backstory. You know, most of the time, whether it's an elite athlete or whether it's a junior athlete that's just been identified with high potential, it's very important to first and foremost understand the life story. What are the, you know, what kind of parenting, what kind of upbringing, what were defining moments in your life? And oftentimes that just alone throws up so many clues in terms of why the person is so perfectionistic and so uncompromising when they falter, why they have unrealistic expectations of themselves, why they get too in their head, because there's this burden of expectation, and, you know, it's quite clear where that comes from. So we all have a different backstory. And I suppose what I'm saying is, yes, we have a genetic disposition that will make us naturally good at certain things. And I think some of those people are genetically predisposed to being naturally resilient. where another person has to work hard at developing that grit, that discipline, that natural resilience, and all those other factors that we factor into overall mental fitness. But that's the given. And if we are if we were to just sort of passively accept, well, I'm born that way, and that's my lot. It's quite a defeatist approach to take. And I think there's more and more evidence suggesting that there's very exciting and very low-hanging fruit, really, very easily attainable goals to improve whatever it just might mean that, yes, because of my genetic disposition, I might have to work harder to achieve one of the dimensions of mental fitness, where for someone else, it just falls in their lap. It's very easy for them.
Yeah.
But therein lies the challenge: is let's understand what are our natural gifts and strengths, and where do we have to do a little bit more heavy lifting, so to speak, and what needs to be more of our focus, because we don't need to. That's low maintenance for us. It's easy for us. It's like falling off a log. But X, Y, and Z is more difficult for us. It just means we've got to work it more. That's all.
Yeah. And I love the way that you frame that, because I think coming with our genetic testing that we do, and we're trying to move away from this scenario of boxing people and people getting a genetic report and seeing their results and saying, oh, well, exactly as you say, this is my lot in life. These are my genetics. I can't change my DNA.
Sure.
But definitely there's the epigenetics, the components that, what are we doing in our life and with our lifestyle, and what are we eating, and how are we training to enhance or support or help develop certain areas. And I think that's so exciting that, athletes can access psychologists like you to really refine and make a difference in their sporting performance, no matter their level, really.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But Neil, I'm going to put some pressure on you now and ask if you can maybe give us a bit of a case study of I mean, you keep the athlete anonymous, obviously, but maybe just give us an idea of an athlete presenting with a certain issue, what you did to help them, and where they are today.
Sure. Quite a couple come to mind. Let's think of a young man. He's a golfer, very high potential. He is in the throes of qualifying to get his pro ticket to be able to play professionally and earn a living out of golf. And he gets consistent feedback that he is gifted. He's going to sort of set the world alight in terms of his golf. He's got amazing potential, and there's great opportunities that lie ahead. And why does he come to see me? Well, notwithstanding all of that, he's underperforming. And there's this discrepancy between the expectations and the sort of promise and his actual performance. But soon as I start engaging with him, amazing young man, and fortunately very insightful and very open and receptive to sort of learning, he starts to actually establish, and because he's an intelligent guy and he's quite a sensitive person, this expectation has become more of a burden than it is a affirmation to him. So when he gets to practicing, for example, and there's no pressure, or he plays in a very low stakes local tournament, he shoots the lights out. And the minute there's a high stakes tournament, or he's got to go and play overseas, etc., and there's going to be scouts there and whatever else, then suddenly the self-doubt creeps in. These incredibly well-tested and well-coached routines and pre-warm-up and warm-up phases are all they sort of disintegrate, and
Burn
he
out of
starts to
order.
second guess everything, and he starts to get too in his head. So I think, and I'm maybe not adequately answering the question, but that's just one example of someone who there's absolutely nothing wrong. He is truly very talented, and this is, this isn't someone who's operating in a blind spot where he thinks he's fantastic, but in fact there's consistent feedback that at best he going to play golf socially or for in a club league. This is someone who truly is able to achieve what he is setting out to achieve. But there's a part of his psychology that is still self-doubting and putting too much pressure on him when he's meant to just be focusing on his process. Okay, so the self-narrative is just not serving him well at all. And when you start looking into his background, he was quite a sort of average youngster at school. Wasn't one of the boys, so to speak. He at stages was sort of sometimes bullied, but basically wasn't always in a safe, nurturing environment. And what happens is, and I'm maybe digressing, but hopefully we'll come back to the point. I always describe to athletes the metaphor of the iceberg when we talk about our own psychology. And just like when we see an iceberg, we're only seeing 10% of it above the waterline and 90% below the waterline. Well, so too with our psyche. So he's at times saying, no, I'm going to do well. I'm going to be confident. I'm really going to play well in this tournament. I'm not going to miss shots. I'm not going to do this. And he's making 100% effort, but it's 100% of 10% of consciousness. But subconsciously, there's all this other negative narrative lurking. And what if I mess up? And what if I disappoint my parents? They've made such an effort in terms of allowing me to follow this path. My coaches would be disappointed. Well, that's all just wheel spin, and it's not helpful at all. And it's the voice of the subconscious. And fortunately, a guy like him, he is smart enough and he's open enough and receptive enough to understand it. And he starts to change the script. So he starts to learn to talk differently to himself. He starts to learn through a number of techniques, which we wouldn't be able to go into detail now. He learns to focus on process rather than result. So he learns to actually repeatedly say to himself, I'm standing over the ball, I'm addressing the ball now. It's not the time to think about whether I'm going to make the leaderboard or not. That's done and dusted. My focus is now in my bubble. And he, for instance, him and I worked on, and for him, it worked to have colors as a metaphor. Okay, so we worked on what would an ideal state feel like for him. What would he be thinking? What would he be feeling physically and emotionally? And that would relate to a color that he liked. And then a color that he didn't have much of a liking for would be, he would describe all this negative in my head. I'm feeling anxious. I'm self-doubting, etc., etc. And he then eventually became, and I mean, it's work in progress. He's become much better and much more masterful at being able to say, well, wait a bit, I'm going into red. I need to go back to green. And because of the amount of time that we've worked in terms of his relaxation exercises and his little mind control techniques, etc., etc., he's able to identify when he's the wrong color and how he can get himself back to the right color, and how he can get himself to focus on process and not outcome. That's a long-winded answer to a process that obviously is, it's ongoing. But that's, I think just very quickly, I think the common theme, and I see it with a lot of people, is I, for instance, worked with a guy who races superbikes, for example, and how he described that if, for instance, if he qualifies in the qualifying rounds, he has a bad qualification and he starts the race at the back of the grid, he races phenomenally because there's no pressure of expectation. As the minute he qualifies on the front of the, on the front row of the grid, there's suddenly this expectation. And he has identified how it literally in fine nuances changes his body posture on the bike, his lean angles, his braking points, a whole lot of technical things that I don't even understand. But he knows how that influences when he's in the wrong mindset. There's just so much one can.
Yeah, no, I mean, my head is spinning at the moment with all these questions that I want to ask you, but yeah, we don't really have the time for it. But it's essentially giving the athlete the tools to identify where the problem is and how to deal with that problem, and to almost take the negative and make it into a positive. And I think, many of these high-performing athletes, or all of them, I would suspect, are working with coaches. And, just very quickly, just talk about the role of coaches and how they can support athletes in terms of the mental side of things. Because I think, coaches obviously have a big focus on the physical side. But I think now they need to be more and more clued up as to how to help athletes become mentally resilient, and, all their focus and visualization and all those kind of aspects.
Yeah. I think it's a critically important component that I don't think can be underestimated. I mean, if you think of them, and as you correctly point out, there's no athletes operating at an elite level that are not part of a coaching process. I mean, whether that's a team, whether that's individual. And if you think of the amount of contact time that a coach has with an athlete, compared to the contact time I would have with them, they are such huge influences in those people's life. And I see many athletes, young athletes, who have fallen out of love with a particular sport because of a coach, or have endured enormous adversity, and who have gone the distance and shot the lights out also because of a coach. So they play a pivotal role. They have such an important relationship. And I think part of it is, and we're working more and more with coaching groups where it's literally just, you're not expected, you don't have the mandate, and probably you don't have the time and focus to be the sports psychologist. But it's also not rocket science. It's not highly complex stuff. If it's just to learn enough to understand that there's not one size fits all. So as a coach, I need to understand the diversity of the group of people that I'm coaching. That some people would want their affirmation in one way and another in another. For some people, X approach is motivating, and for others it's not. And I suppose it starts with just understanding that you need to be able to be sensitized to how different your group is that you're coaching. Which buttons do I need to push, and which buttons do I not? And then I think the other thing is for the coach to create a safe space for people to go to a place of vulnerability where they may even say, you know what, coach, I'm really backing here. And to, for instance, that coach can be the gatekeeper to, for instance, filter that information to appropriate people so that they can get support. There was the incident a little while back of a Premier League soccer player in the UK who announced that he was having mental health challenges. And the coach and that whole coaching staff just rallied to this man's support unbelievably. And the bottom line is that person felt safe to go to that place of vulnerability, and it was liberating for him rather than it was shaming or compromising. So I think that is such an important thing that coaches can do. And also, to have enough insight about the psychology of performance and about where each of their athletes are, to know when is it appropriate to refer on, and then to know who to refer to. So the coach can can sort of do some of the so-called psychology 101 stuff, because you can't refer everyone to a sports psychologist.
Yeah.
But they can at least be more mindful of some of the principles and some of the psychology of performance generally, and be more dialed into that. And then in addition, to be very well informed as to, you know what, this is now out of my wheelhouse, and I think it's appropriate to refer, whether it's to a psychologist, psychiatrist, or whoever else.
Yeah. No, all very good points. And, you know, something that's just come to mind, and maybe we can just finish off with this, Neil, is that, you know, yes, we've been talking very much about high performing and elite level athletes, but they're also just those everyday athletes who have, you know, signed up for very big goals. You know, I think of an athlete who's completed the full Ironman, and
Yeah.
you know, something, you know, an athlete, we call them athletes as well, facing an event of that nature. What are the tips that you can give to just our everyday athletes in terms of dealing with anxiety, dealing with setbacks in their training, how to get back on track? I mean, just some general thoughts, maybe.
You know, probably firstly to acknowledge and affirm what you're saying is that to immerse oneself in the psychology of performance is not the exclusive domain of elite athletes by a long shot. I mean, I see a lot of people who fall into the category you've just described. You know, there's someone who's decided to run their first marathon, or, you know, is now wanting to start a discipline that is unfamiliar to them, but they're passionate about it, and so on. So absolutely, there's as much relevance for people like that to engage with a sports psychologist. But I think the general principle would be, you've got, and I always talk about, we've got to walk that fine balance where we've got to walk and chew gum at the same time. And what do I mean by that? What I mean is, we embrace the challenge to understand more of what makes us tick and why. So even if it's simple as drawing a line down the middle of the page and saying, what am I good at? And what in terms of mental fitness, what's easy for me? What are my strengths? Oh, I'm very disciplined. I tend to not get caught up in negativity and so on. Great. At least you know that. And then what are the chinks in my armor? Whatever that may be. So you actually, conscientizing is the psychological term. You're bringing it to consciousness. It's not, you're not being spooked by it. It's, you have line of sight of, these are my strengths and these are my weaknesses. Then the second tip, which is very general, is when we are in adversity or we are facing a challenge, etc., and if we could choose a friend to walk that journey with us, what kind of friend would we choose? We're not going to choose a bad friend who's going to shame us and who's going to constantly be shaming and overly self-critical, etc., We're going to choose a good friend who we know is going to tell us what we need to hear, but they're going to do it with love and compassion. So my second point that I make is, you better be a good friend to yourself on this journey. You can't afford to be a bad friend.
Yeah.
Just cut yourself some slack. Be compassionate. That doesn't mean that you're rolling over and submitting to your weaknesses or anything else. It just means that you're being a good friend to yourself. And then I suppose lastly is to that reminder that it's like it's no different to any other skill. It's practice and it's repetition. So I go back to my walk and chew gum. You don't want to only develop these amazing insights and self-insights as to what makes you tick, but you don't change anything. So yes, you peel off enough layers to understand and be able to connect the dots as to the why I'm battling with this and why am I battling with that. But you still have to do the heavy lifting. You still have to change specific behaviors, thought by thought, or thoughts and belief systems, thought by thought and action by action. So that's what I mean by the walk and chew gum, and to back yourself that you can do that. And then perhaps lastly, and I sort of just coming to mind as we go, but lastly, is set yourself up for small victories. Don't, in terms of a particular goal, or you've identified a particular shortcoming that you have or challenge that you have, don't go and set this overly audacious goal that is actually more likely that at the end of the day or the week or whatever time frame you've given is going to reveal that you haven't made it. Make it easy to have to feel victory and to feel the affirming positivity of, right, I've ticked that box, and then celebrate it. Anyway, there's so much more going on in my head, but
yeah, I know, and in mine. But it's so fascinating to peel back the layers on this subject. It really is. And I think at the end of the day, you really just highlight the fact that, like, we have to put in the hard yards for, physical body, we have to do exactly the same with our mental capacity and state. And I think that's what so many people miss. And it's been enlightening chatting to you today, Neil. Neil, if you can just give us where people can get hold of you, that would be fantastic.
Sure. There's a number that people can phone, and someone will pass on a message to me that I could reach out to whoever makes contact. And that number is 087 1350 384 during office hours. Are also more than welcome to email me on neil@performwell.co.za. That's Neil, Neil, @performwell.co.za, or to go to my website, performwell.co.za, and there's an option to sort of submit a request for me to make contact, which I would happily do as soon as I'm able to get to it.
Yes.
It'll be a pleasure to.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Neil. I've so enjoyed our chat today, and I think there are some more subjects in there that we can flesh out a little bit more, possibly in
Only a pleasure.
But wonderful to have you with us today, and thanks again.